Hey everyone. In my journeys through Twitter, I ran across this individual, Erasmus, who invited me to watch a video he had done on creation versus evolution. I told him I would be addressing it on my channel, along with a couple of others he has done about flat earth, anti-vax, and his position on the Bible being the literal word of God, just to name a few. The main problem seems to be a misunderstanding on several points that cumulatively brought him to his conclusions. To be clear, before I continue, I would prefer if you do visit his channel to be as polite and reasonable as possible, something I failed to do initially in our interactions on Twitter, and as a result, it almost stonewalled the discussion. I see him as simply misinformed, and as a result of a few oversights in examining the sources he pulled from, was given bad information. He's a victim of that bad information in my mind, and I feel I can address that information to his satisfaction. Channel regulars should note that my focus has unfortunately shifted away from the threat of God and Your Next Period of Instruction series because Hovind and Erasmus have both come to my attention for different reasons. For such a short video, we have a lot to cover, so I'll be dividing it into two parts, with this one covering his first 3 points and point number 5. 4 will be skipped here because he did a two-parter on it specifically, so I'll cover it when I get to those videos. Let's get started.
So in this video, I'm going to be making the arguments that I believe are the most compelling, and I will be providing my evidence that evolution is a lie and creation is true. Evidence 1. There is no evidence for evolution. Atheists like to claim that there is no evidence for God and that there is no evidence for creation, but I claim that there actually isn't any evidence for evolution. Never once has evolution ever been observed, and it has never once been tested. Now, if you say this to an atheist, they will usually bring up examples of bacteria or flies or salamanders. The problem with this is that they are still the same kind. I will be reading an excerpt from Answers in Genesis, which is actually a fantastic website, and there should be a link to the specific article in the description. This is a really good article, and I would recommend checking it out for yourself if you're interested. Now, I know this is kind of a lot, but I think it's necessary to make the point that I'm trying to convey. Often people are confused into thinking that a species is a kind, but this isn't necessarily so. A species is a man-made term used in the modern classification system, and frankly, the word species is difficult to define, whether one is a creationist or not. The Bible uses the term kind. The Bible first use of the word Hebrew is found in Genesis 1 when God creates plants and animals according to their kinds. It is used again in Genesis chapter 6 and 8 when God instructs Noah to take 2 of every kind of land-dwelling, air-breathing animal onto the ark, and also in God's command for the animals to reproduce after the flood. A plain reading of the text infers that plants and animals were created to reproduce within the boundaries of their kind. Evidence to support this concept is clearly seen, or rather not seen, in our world today, as there are no reports of dats, dog plus cat, or hows, horse plus cow. So a good rule of thumb is that if 2 things can breed together, then they are the same created kind. It is a bit more complicated than this, but for the time being, this is a quick measure of a kind. So the Bible is very clear about what a kind is. So according to this definition, it is obvious that evolution is not actually occurring, because in order for evolution to occur, speciation has to occur, which has been observed. Or I'm sorry, it's never been observed.
As my regular audience can see, there is a lot to unpack here. Setting aside for the moment that the existence of God is irrelevant to evolution, we need to start with the usage of the word kind. I've covered this before, but it bears repeating here. The word kind is a problem because it has no equivalent label in taxonomy. Ken Ham has said he will use the term arbitrarily and walk it back to equate with species, genus, family, and even all the way back to order if he has to within the old Linnaean classification system, which only had 7 ranks originally. I say old because we now use a phylogenetic system of clades to classify life. More on that in a moment. The way you defined the term kind equates with species in this case, though I have seen people define it like we define clades, so we will stick with your own definition of the term. I know you bring up the definition of species in your next point, so we'll clarify then. I'm not going to go into what kind actually means in the Bible in detail here. I'll do that when I get to the videos you did on the Bible being the Word of God. There is a reason we bring up bacteria, fruit flies, and my personal favorite, the Galapagos finches. Yes, when we say they are different species of finch, we are aware that they are still finches. Evolution does not demand that they turn into something else the way that you might think. The examples you cited of crossbreeding a dog and a cat or a horse and a cow is not what evolution is and would break the law of monophyly in particular. Such a thing happening would disprove evolution and not be evidence for it. Let me explain. This is where monophyletic clades come into play, but before we get to that, I need to cover speciation. So let's take a look at Berkeley University Evolution 101. To start us off, we need to clarify what evolution is properly defined as. Evolution, at its most basic level, is changes in allele frequency, better described as descent with inherent genetic modification, meaning that each generation is slightly different than its ancestors. You are not a carbon copy of your parents because of recombination of genetic material in the reproductive gamete cells, along with an average of 120 mutations that are unique to you. These alleles determine your physical characteristics, such as eye color, skin tone, height, body size, etc. Now, I am fairly certain that you're having issue with the whole mutation thing, but those are mostly neutral, having no effect on survivability, and even the ones that do have some effect, whether they are good or bad, are generally suppressed by recombination with other sexual partners within the population, so it takes time for any noticeable change to become apparent. Notice that I'm using the words generations and populations. That is because evolution happens to populations and not individuals, a point I need to make very clear. Evolution doesn't work like popular culture has generally described it. X-Men, Star Trek, and other pop cultures that try to implement evolution into a storyline wind up getting it wrong in some way, and usually horribly so. As an example, let's look at the Galapagos finches. I'm going to summarize a bit here, but the ancestral group of all these species wound up on the archipelago about 1 million or so years ago. Yes, I can hear you protesting, but give me a minute here. We have a lot of information to cover, and I will be getting into how we know that in a bit. All of this is actually relevant. Now, the finches wound up in a pretty sweet situation. An abundance of food with no natural predators since they were effectively an invasive species at the time. They soon spread unrestricted across the whole archipelago, but ran into another issue: competition for food. This is where the first working mechanism for evolution discovered comes into play: natural selection. There was a strong pressure introduced to find uncontested food sources, which is where we get the different beak shapes in particular on all these finches. Some beak shapes and sizes were more suited to certain types of food, so they started feeding exclusively on those sources. Since evolution works on populations, they started mating with those finches that shared their food supply because they were nearby. This is an important point. When you separate a population by geographic barriers or sexual preference, that suppression of mutations that we talked about earlier is relaxed, which accelerates the diversification and emergence of these beak shapes, forming a series of ring species. There are degrees of separations that we need to cover here. One group may be interfertile with neighboring groups and produce something that looks like a hybrid of the two. However, if they are not sexually preferred, they are a different subspecies because of that separation and lack of interest in breeding. If they remain separated and isolated for long enough, they are no longer interfertile and move from a subspecies to a new species. Yes, they are still finches, but evolution does not demand that it become something its ancestors were not, nor does it demand that the ancestral group go extinct. To that end, there is a new species of finch forming there now. Biodiversity means more and more, with one species becoming 2, 4, 8, 16, so on, with extinctions getting rid of lines that could not compete for one reason or another. This also allows the ancestral group itself to change over time. That brings us to monophyletic clades. There are two terms you need to be familiar with here. The law of monophyly is an evolutionary law that, in its most basic sense, is that you cannot grow out of your ancestry. That means that you will always be what your ancestors were, and this is how we determine clades. A clade is a common ancestor and all of its descendants, living and extinct. and they are nested in parental sets. The way that we determine these common characteristics to define clades is through a few methods, such as morphological character analysis, embryological development, and genetic sequencing, all of which I will go into more detail on if you wish. Using this image from this end to that end, and bearing in mind that I am omitting literally dozens of named clades, we can see that we are, for example, animals, because we are multicellular organisms with a digestive tract that must ingest and digest other organisms to survive. If it describes you, it defines you, to put it as simply as possible. Within that parental set, we have another daughter group that we're going to be moving into in the middle part of this image. We'll use vertebrates for this one because we have a spinal column. And for the last nested set, we are mammals because we have body-wide hair follicles and mammary glands specifically, along with several other traits. If you go down any of those other paths, you end up describing something else. Even AIG has to admit the existence of clades, and to their credit, have tried to make their own cladograms in a study called baraminology, with the root of each clade being a single created kind which is unrelated to anything else. The problem is that every time they try to show this or that is unrelated, we can show that they actually are. I will cover more on that next time with, I think, point 6, the one where you say evolution is illogical. Oh, before I forget, genomic sequencing shows a common ancestry with birds on the mainland, in the case of the Galapagos finches, a point that I will probably expand on in point 6 as well. Let's move on.
Evidence 2. 7 distinct definitions for species. My next point is closely related to this evidence 1, but I feel that it deserves its own time. According to this article by The Guardian, there are seven distinct definitions for species. Once again, the link will be in the description. Just to list all these definitions without defining them is going to take a while, so just pause the video on any one of them if you're interested in reading the definition. But I'm going to read out the names. I'm just going to read them out. Typological or morphological species, recognition and cohesion species, genetic similarity and barcode species, phylogenetic, cladistic or evolutionary species, ecological species, genetic species, evolutionary significant unit, chronospecies, viral quasi-species. That's just what I could find, and there's a good chance I missed a few. In the Bible, there's only one definition, as described in the previous point, so that is why I believe the Bible is much more reliable in terms of keeping definitions straight.
Right, so I checked your source, and early on I see this, which is accurate. See, the definitions you list don't define what species are, as in Homo sapiens, but it's how we identify species. This is a key distinction. What you have listed are how we identify those divisions. Take, for example, the first one that you list, typological or morphological species. This one is where the layman can recognize the same taxon, like Canis lupus familiaris, the domestic dog, or Felis sylvestris, the house cat. This is where we get that whole dogs produce dogs thing that creationists inevitably throw out in discussions. It's a very broad method of classification dating back to Linnaeus, but defining species goes a bit deeper than that. For example, Linnaeus himself could not find a character trait showing man was not related to apes, and demanded the scientific community of his day to show him one. What followed is a perfect example of science being a self-correcting process. See, what happened was that being unable to face the fact that humans are apes, a point that I will cover in more detail in point 6 next time, the scientific community created a separate class called Pongo, where they shoved all apes except humans. Obviously, this did not stand up and was eventually fixed much later. Linnaeus was a creationist who tried to find that elusive set of created kinds, and he could not explain the branching tree pattern we see, and it wasn't until Darwin that we got the solution. Another example of how these terms are used to identify species is this one. Ecological species, or those organisms filling a specific ecological niche, like the finches from before. One group feeds on nuts, another on ticks, and so on. I realize that this particular point may be, well, difficult, but the word species does have a clear meaning, and the methods used in identifying species are what are being defined here. At the risk of sounding condescending, though, Sources like this are an okay place to start research. Peer review articles and studies are obviously preferred. I have made my point here, but if you want, let me know, and I will cover each of these definitions and what they mean in greater detail in a follow up. But we need to continue.
Evidence 3. Evolution is not science. To quote somebody I have a great deal of respect for, evolution is not a science, never has, and never will be. Josh Fierstein. The scientific method is as follows. Ask a question, do background research, construct a hypothesis, test with experiment, analyze data, draw a conclusion, communicate results. Now, for a lot of these, evolution fits. Question, am I a monkey? Research, science says yes. Hypothesis, I am a monkey. But then it gets to experiment, and we can see that the evolutionist worldview begins to fall apart. Because how do you test evolution if it cannot be observed? This is why evolution is not science.
Yes, the evolution is not science thing. But to be blunt, and at the risk of sounding rude, Fierstein is not an authoritative source on what science is, let alone what evolution is or how it works. You seem to have allowed yourself to become encased in an echo chamber, which is part of what I am here to deal with. Your layout of the scientific method is mostly accurate, but I need to address a couple of important points here, and we will use your example to do that. Setting aside that the question, am I a monkey, is indeed a valid, if broad question, we need to come at this more incrementally and start with something like, are humans apes? Since apes are, at the very least, morphologically similar to us and us to them, this covers doing background research as well, which also looks at the possibility and probability of a given question. Based on morphological similarities, it is possible and probable that we are apes, since there is no significant difference in character traits aside from proportions. We have the same bones, the same basic structure, the same dentition, and the same social abilities like recognizing our place in a hierarchy just as they do. This isn't just science says yes, since all of these things are objectively verifiable. Thankfully, we're not limited to morphology anymore, and we have genetic sequencing we can look at too. This brings us to constructing a hypothesis, which itself has to be testable and falsifiable, meaning that it has to have a failure point, a point at which we can say that it's not working or that the idea we had is wrong. So let's make one. We can't use your I am a monkey hypothesis because it is much too broad. We do have something we can test for and does meet the criteria to be falsifiable. If, as you likely maintain, we share no relationship with apes, then we should be able to look for something in their DNA and in our own, and not find it in ours. So we can say that as a hypothesis, if humans and apes are unrelated, we should find no similar strains of DNA between humans and apes. But we can refine this further to look for specific genes that are responsible for things that we do not exhibit and would have no reason to have. So we will look for one of the genes responsible for the formation of the massive jaw muscles that are found in other apes. Specifically, we will look for MYH16, which codes for the protein known as myosin heavy chain 16. This protein is key in forming those large masticatory muscles in apes, and since we don't have them, we can now construct a very specific hypothesis, which will be this. If humans and apes are unrelated, we should not be able to find the MYH16 gene in human DNA. Very specific, testable, and falsifiable. So how do we test it? Easy. We run a sequence of the specific section that has that gene and see if it pops up, which we have already done, and it does pop up in our DNA. In humans, there is a mutation in that gene that affects the way it forms myosin heavy chain 16 proteins. The gene is there, it makes a protein, but that protein doesn't work in us, and is one of the things that allowed us to develop our greatest asset, our brains. Evolution isn't about getting bigger or stronger all the time. Sometimes the loss of something works in benefit of the organism. Now, DNA is incredibly powerful evidence of relatedness. And it isn't just that one gene we share with apes. There are entire sections that are a match. Combined with the molecular clock, we can trace back the time frame for this mutation, which matches with other independent dating methods, like radiometric dating of fossils showing this divergence. Bear in mind that DNA evidence alone is enough to get a conviction in a court of law and carries enough weight to get a death sentence on its own without anything else. This is the same accuracy as a paternity test. So yes, we can construct valid hypotheses and experiments to prove common descent and that evolution is not only science, but an indisputable fact of biology with more evidence supporting it than any other scientific theory. We even have a new computer modeling algorithm that was developed in the last few days that shows great promise in accurately predicting the evolution of mutations. Evolution is the only theory of biodiversity that accounts for all the data, with everything we find being consistent with it. Even if it were proven wrong tomorrow, another theory would have to be put up in its place. That explains everything it did not account for and all the data that it did already account for, while being testable and falsifiable itself. As I mentioned earlier, I'm skipping point 4 to cover in an upload later on down the line. So let's move on to point 5.
Evidence 5. Every design must have a designer. The watchmaker analogy is as old as time and has been cited by creationists for many years, and for good reason. It is one of the strongest arguments for the existence of God and creation. The watchmaker argument is as follows. In crossing a heath, suppose I pitched my foot against a stone, and were asked how the stone came to be there, I might possibly answer that for anything I knew to the for anything I knew to the contrary, it had lain there forever. Nor would it perhaps be very easy to show the absurdity of the answer. But suppose I had found a watch upon the ground, and it should be inquired how the watch happened to be in that place. I should hardly think of the answer which I had before given, that for anything I knew the watch might have always been there. The watch must have had a maker, that there must have existed at some time and at some other place or other an artificer or artificers who formed it into the purpose which we find it actually to answer, who comprehended its construction and designed its use. Every indication of contrivance, every manifestation of design which existed in the watch exists in the works of nature, of being greater or more, and that in a degree which exceeds all computation. Now there are many different variations of this argument having to do with Ferraris, log cabins, and soda cans, but the general point is always consistent. A design must have a designer. It's common sense.
The watchmaker argument. I am sure I have covered this in another video, but it seems like it could use a more personal touch in this case. So, how do I put this? Yes, a watch, a car, a building, or whatever other man made examples of engineering we have does require a designer. The key point this argument omits is that those things are not alive. They cannot reproduce naturally on their own like life can. They do not experience mutation or selective pressures like life does. Life does not require a designer, and one is not indicated anywhere. If there was a designer indicated, I would concede that point, and we would not be having this particular discussion. Even if I concede that a designer kick-started the universe or made the first cells, which I don't due to a lack of evidence, that still does nothing to disprove evolution. If there were any evidence against evolution, and I am aware of none, that is not simultaneously evidence of a designer. You need both if you want to say that creation is a better model. The length of this is not deliberate, but it was necessary. I have unfortunately only been able to cover some of the things briefly, so if you want me to expand on anything, let me know. I'll cover the rest of your points next time, while of course being as brief as I possibly can be.